When the eagerly awaited PlayStation 2 hit store shelves in the fall of 2000, it arrived alongside the largest lineup of launch titles in history up to that point, with 29 games ready for sale on that fateful October 26th. While there were a lot of games, very few stood out as truly killer titles. Namco brought its Tekken and Ridge Racer games, which were PlayStation staples. Electronic Arts brought some of its sports games to the mix. New titles like Dynasty Warriors 2 and Time Splitters made good first impressions as rough drafts for a series that would grow much more popular over time. But perhaps the most standout title among this giant launch lineup would be a brand new title called SSX. The game was the brainchild of a producer at Electronic Arts named Steven Rechtschaffner, who gained a lot of goodwill within the company for pioneering its move into baseball games with its Triple Play series. He himself had been a professional skier with the U.S. freestyle team in the early 1980s, and so with the necessary degree of clout within EA secured, he took his opportunity to create a game that would bring winter sports into the spotlight. However, unlike many of Electronic Arts' other sports games, Rechtschaffner went into this project not with the intention of making a realistic simulation of a snowboarding game, which had been proving remarkably popular at that time with the Cool Borders series and with 1080 snowboarding. But instead, they went in with the intention to invert the usual EA formula and make a very arcade-style game set around a sport, where the gameplay mechanics and sense of fun came first, and the resemblance to the actual sport came second. The game actually started its earliest stages of development on the Dreamcast, but by early 1999, the breakdown in negotiations between Sega and EA led to it being moved over to the recently announced PlayStation 2. A look at early builds of the game reportedly impressed Sony representatives, who offered their own technical support to make sure the game could be a launch title. While opinions within Electronic Arts itself were mixed, as it certainly didn't fit the mold of what EA games were at that time. But by the time the game was finished and debuted alongside Sony's new console, it became quite clear that they had a hit on their hands, and Rechtschaffner's bet on cashing in his goodwill had paid off tremendously, so much so that he got Electronic Arts to form a whole new brand for these kinds of more accessible, casual, arcade-style sports games that it would call EA Sports Big. SSX would even be EA's first game to be shown off for the PlayStation 2, when they were the only Western developer to be invited by Sony to show off its games at its pre-launch Japanese convention in late February of 2000. At that time, the game was still known as SSX Snowboard Supercross, in order to explain the acronym behind the title. But that would disappear by the time it launched in North America in October, and would become one of the best-selling early games for the PlayStation 2 that Christmas. At this same time, in December of 2000, EA Canada was getting its hands on its first GameCube development kits from Nintendo, and began testing out what they could do with the new system. It was revealed by IGN that they were working on an upgraded version of SSX, simply called SSX Special Edition, that would be used by the studio to test both the ease of the development environment for the GameCube, as well as using the game as an eventual test release for the sales potential of EA games on the console. This enhanced port would be unveiled by the official PlayStation magazine in February of 2001, which referred to the new version as SSX DVD, which reflected the fact that the original SSX was one of the games at the PlayStation 2 launch that shipped not on the heavily touted DVD format, but on the old CD-ROM format that was a holdover from the original PlayStation, but was still an option for PS2 games, especially those early launch games that might not need the multiple gigabytes of a DVD disc. When the game appeared at E3 2001, it was clear that the team had gone back over every aspect of the game with a fine-tooth comb and did everything they could to fill out that DVD capacity. It wasn't a sequel, but instead a kind of version 1.5, a director's cut, or for those with a more cynical point of view, it was a remake of a 7-month-old game. The new version had 6 more characters, a cast of famous voice actors to play them, redesigned levels with additional shortcuts, and a new tier of even more difficult Uber tricks. They would also be tweaking the engine and pulling more power out of the PS2 and the new systems to bring the frame rate up to 60 frames per second. As far as filling out the multimedia possibilities of a DVD, the game would have its own special bonus features area, including a small making-of documentary, as well as an updated, remixed soundtrack with additions from Mixmaster Mike of the Beastie Boys, Aphrodite, the Plump DJs, and others. EA was happy enough with what they had put together that they would even be taking the extra step of releasing the game's soundtrack as a music CD release, something pretty uncommon outside of Japan. However, only the PlayStation 2 version was on display at E3. It would be 2 more months until EA hosted its own Gamers Day event in California that the first look at the Xbox and GameCube versions would come, although EA stressed they were still both in pre-alpha states. The Xbox version displayed visible graphical glitches and warping, while the GameCube version showed worse texture quality and a lower frame rate than the PlayStation 2 version. But the focus between the two appeared to be on the Xbox version, since it was getting additional graphical features like specular highlights, bump mapping, and even more advanced shadow casting. In fact, the GameCube version wasn't even running on finalized development kits, but on one of the earlier versions of the development kit that was no longer being used. The actual precious few GameCube kits EA had were back with the development team in Canada, and they couldn't spare them for public demonstrations. Still, the game was making further progress, as the developers revealed they were adding 2 new levels to the game that weren't in the original. They would also need to make some choices between meeting their 60 frames per second goal and tuning down some of the graphical effects they were implementing, or they could go all for graphical splendor, and they could leave the frame rate at the 30 frames per second mark. Plus, since the GameCube and Xbox controllers had less shoulder buttons than the PlayStation 2, they would also be making a few choices to reduce the trick combinations that could be pulled off in those versions. But the journalists there to cover Nintendo were concerned that the GameCube version was noticeably behind the PS2, although there was still a few months to iron that out. Those fears were not allayed, however, when the game appeared at Space World 2001 in August and looked pretty much the same, with the lower quality textures and still having a dodgy frame rate. At this point, EA announced the game would also be incorporating digital theater surround sound for the PS2 version. The GameCube version would still have surround sound, but between the GameCube, PS2, and Xbox, the GameCube was the only system that didn't have a digital audio port, or at least the option for one, so it would have to forego the option for digital audio. Although in the end it wouldn't matter that much here, since both versions of the game had the same 4-channel surround sound mix. When the game finally shipped, on November 27, 2001, it would live up to every impression it had made in its public demonstrations by being a half-assed port of the PlayStation 2 version. The lower quality textures were still there, and the frame rate bounced between 30 and 60 frames per second. Unlike EA's first GameCube game, Madden 2002, it also did not support progressive scan output. On top of all that, much of the special feature content from the other versions was cut, and the remaining making-of video was compressed in order to fit onto the GameCube's smaller capacity mini-DVD. Although once again, the smaller discs did allow for faster load times on the GameCube. So what's SSX all about? From what I can tell, it's about going fast, looking cool, and having fun pulling off tricks. Popping into the game takes you to a screen with 3 areas: the practice mode, the single event, and the world circuit. There's also an options menu hidden away from this screen a little bit if you hit the Y button. The options gives you a few extras, such as the ability to customize the controls, turn on surround sound, and toggle the display mode between a standard 4x3 mode, a stretched widescreen mode, and a 16:9 mode with screen bars on top and bottom. The practice mode gives you exactly what you need in one, especially someone like me who hasn't played this game before. You get a free ride mode that lets you just play totally unrestrained and unstructured to get the feel for things. More helpfully though, there's also a trick learning mode that will teach you how to pull off each of your rider's tricks, which is quite an extensive catalog entailing several books of 5 tricks each. The tutorial mode here does correctly what I had trouble with in Wave Race Blue Storm. It runs the trick, showing you with the GameCube controller on screen what buttons to press and at what time, and then lets you run the same track with the controller still present on screen. Outside of practice mode, whichever mode you choose, you'll get a big lineup of colorful characters. With each, you get the menu options to customize their outfits and boards, which you can unlock more of as you play and get various achievements. You get a little profile on each character, giving some stats and backstories, and the list of tricks they can pull off that you've unlocked so far. Oh, and you can change the name you save your character with. The single race is essentially an arcade mode, allowing you to just jump in and play a single race, either alone or in multiplayer. Of course, there's the Grand Circuit mode, which is the single-player campaign to the game. All of these modes use the same tracks. Granted, you just start off with a few and unlock more as you win races. As for actually playing, the game is relatively simple. You take off from the top of the mountain and head downhill at a breakneck pace. You can take off from the sides of the course, or the well-labeled jump points to try and pull off some tricks. Depending on what mode you're playing in, you can either focus on running up the trick score or just winning the race. Personally, I was more for the racing side of things, as this came across to me like a snowboarding version of Road Rash, another Electronic Arts franchise that made a more cartoonish and extreme take on a different sport, motorbiking. I say this specifically because this is the first game I've seen since Road Rash that lets you straight up beat your opponents as you race. A wonderful way to level the playing field for someone not that adept at racing games. Plus, it's fun as hell. As the title of the game implies, one of the biggest additions to this version over the original SSX is the Tricky system, which appears rather obnoxiously along the side of the screen. As you pull off tricks, you can build this meter up, and once it goes off, you can go a little Super Saiyan, speeding up, racking up points, or pulling off tricks. I wouldn't care much for the Tricky meter since I'm not terribly great at getting the tricks down, but was pleasantly surprised to find that knocking off one of your opponents automatically sets off the Tricky meter. Other nice touches that add to the depth of the game include the adversarial system, whereby different characters are either allied, enemies, or neutral, and can be influenced by how you interact with them on the course. Characters actually remember these interactions, so you can influence who you make enemies with, and that'll change how they behave towards you while you're racing. Another improvement the redesign of the game brought with it was the addition of more and creatively designed shortcuts through the levels that can be discovered, giving the game a fresh way to play each level, each time, since there's no one route through them and you can get a bit of replay value going through and trying to find each and every one of them. Even though the GameCube version is the runt of the litter graphically, SSX Tricky is still a good-looking game. With its cartoonish style for its characters, it ages a bit better than attempting realistically modeled humans. The environments are expansive, shiny, and glitzy, with nice lighting shining in from the spotlights along the course, sparks that shoot off from the fireworks along the jumps, and the flowing textured trail coming from each snowboard cutting up the snow is one of the nicest touches to me. More importantly than the graphics, though, the game plays exceptionally well. The controls are incredibly fluid, with the movement of boarding downhill flowing like gliding on water. I'll freely admit I took a little getting used to pulling off tricks at first, resulting in a lot of crashing and wipeouts. But once I got the hang of it, it really is pretty fun to add some tricks into the mix, even if I was more focused on winning the downhill race and beating up other players when I got the chance. Once you get into the groove of what SSX is all about and how it plays, it's undeniably a good time. It's not incredibly deep, and it's not supposed to be. It's a game's game. It's pick up and play. It's stylish, it's well fleshed out, it looks good, sounds good, plays fabulously, and it's fun, which, after all, is what all of this is about at the end of the day.